Hello and welcome to the Ideas Factory. I'm Nakpa. This global pandemic has exposed the many fault lines and the limitations of the global order, of the existing institutions. And there is an increasing realization that the world probably needs a new framework for globalization. At the same time, there is this big question, will the post-COVID-19 world see big shifts in the global order? And if that happens, will it see China at the top, or will it see a consolidation of America as the most powerful country in the world? Or will there be an emergence of a third power center? Joining me on this conversation is Professor Harsh Pant, who is the Director of Studies and Head Strategic Studies Program at the Observer Research Foundation. Welcome to this conversation, Harsh.
Hello.
I want to begin with this US-China face-off once again. It's nothing new. We know that it keeps happening. The trade war has been going on. Trump has been accusing China of the Chinese virus and many other things. But recently, we've seen that Trump has again spoken and said that he's watching China very closely if it is fulfilling all the promises of the trade deal that happened between the two, if it's living up to the trade deal agreement, and if it is purchasing large quantities of American goods. So how do you see this fresh face-off between China and the US? Is it just an empty threat? A lot of times we've seen that nothing has happened really on the ground other than the threats. Or how does it really affect the geopolitics post-COVID-19?
I think what seems to be happening is that over the last week or so, we have seen significant ratcheting up of the pressure of the rhetoric from the American side. And what was interesting was a very interesting Reuters report that came out about China and about how internal Chinese thinking on this matter, which I think at some level also tells you the story of our times, which is that not only the geopolitical contestation between the two most important powers in the world today is getting starker by the day, but also I think there is a certain worry in Beijing as to the backlash that the corona crisis might be generating around the world. So while Americans and the Trump administration, of course, has a reason with the impending elections, the rest of the world is also looking very carefully at what the Chinese have been able to do or not been able to do over the last few months. And I think that is being reflected in a sense in the internal deliberations, if that report is anything to go by. And I think there is certainly no doubt that the CCP feels that it is under pressure. It feels that top leadership feels that it is being scrutinized. And what was striking about that report, that it talks about the almost post Tiananmen Square-like atmosphere in the world about China, which perhaps accurately reflects what many people on the streets might be thinking at the moment about Chinese behavior. So clearly, I think there is a lot of pressure on Beijing at this point in terms of their public perception, in terms of the narrative getting out of control for them, and in terms of the American Trump administration constantly, making it a point to blame it or to make it about China as they, apart from their muddled handling in Washington. So clearly you see this geopolitical contestation getting starker. You do see China getting very worried about it internally, if these reports are anything to go by. And I think it creates an atmosphere of great anxiety for all those states who want a stable international order, especially after COVID, after this crisis.
Of course, we've seen that there's a lot of spotlight on China, and but we've also seen that Beijing, Beijing's effort to present itself as a global leader during this pandemic. In fact, in the response towards the pandemic. So could it also usher in a new world order with China at the top? Because we've been discussing that the American leadership has been missing, there has been mishandling, there's been a lot of chaos. The fresh accusations that we see from America on China is also because of domestic compulsions, because of the November elections that Trump faces. All of that is there. But the way Beijing has presented itself now in post-outbreak, do you think that we're also looking at a world order which could be led by China?
Certainly, I think that becomes a possibility. But I think Chinese behavior itself has also led to a certain kind of a backlash. So while I think a number of the countries might be interested and might be willing to support China and Chinese leadership in the absence of any other leadership coming to the fore, and I think clearly we have seen during the COVID crisis a leadership crisis as well, a global leadership crisis, a global leadership vacuum. But I think the way China has gone about in some ways doing things during this crisis and continues to do raises questions whether it wants to be seen as a responsible global power. So if you see, for example, small diplomatic spats being ratcheted up with Australia, with France, you had the French government had to summon Chinese ambassador. You had a situation where, extraordinary situation where private conversations between Australian and Chinese diplomats were revealed on public platforms. And I think China's also the initial help that China wanted to give or has given not turning out to be quality help, and countries either returning or concerned about the quality of Chinese medical supplies. All of that, I think, raises questions about the way China-led global order might look like. So while there is a lot of concern about the absence of America, there is and largely an absence of leadership, I think at this point there is also a bit of a reluctance to buy into Chinese approach to global order. Absolutely. And that might be a bit of a problem for China, especially if the reports that Chinese are worried about a backlash around the world are correct. Because if those accounts are correct, then clearly Chinese themselves are wondering whether whether they might have overplayed their hand, or whether they would have done it more diplomatically, certain aspects that they are doing. And let us also remember that a lot of these crises, the military crisis, for example, what they are doing in South China Sea, continues to aggravate. So clearly there is a larger picture that the Chinese are presenting, which is not very comfortable to a number of countries.
A lot of countries are very worried and very wary of the predatory trade practices too that China has been practicing. But Harsh, you've also argued in one of the articles that you've written that there is a lot of focus on the US-China binary. But can we see the emergence of actually a third power center, or rather the regional powers? Or are we looking at a more multipolar world? Because we've seen that there's been a lot of talk about South Korea and Taiwan model, the way they handle this emergency, the health emergency. So a lot of middle powers are doing much better. For example, if we look around this area, Taiwan, Korea, many other countries in this area. And then we will also like to look at the Pacific powers, New Zealand and Australia. But all these countries in the regional powers are emerging, looking around their neighbors, taking care of their neighbors. That's an interesting phenomenon.
Yes, I think that is perhaps, if you look to the world today, that seems to be the larger meta-narrative coming out of it, that while we are all focused on US and China so much and their geopolitical contestation, clearly they are major powers, great powers, structural powers, and their antagonism or otherwise will have a major impact on the structural realities of the world. I think we might be overlooking a lot of other things that are happening in the international system. And I think what has happened is clearly that countries have looked around and found a leadership vacuum, and smaller countries, middle powers, middle-ranking players have taken it upon themselves to carry a lot of this burden. Because we need, I think nations need, some kind of leadership, and a smaller engagement, smaller level leadership, middle level leadership that has emerged around the world. Regional, as you were pointing out, regional approaches have been in the offing, whether we are looking at Australia and New Zealand doing much in the Pacific, whether we are looking at South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, despite their internal problems, reaching out to their neighbors. And in fact, there's a very interesting thing about Japan, Japanese lawmakers also trying to help China in this crisis. And I think, so there are these smaller aspects of leadership that are emerging. India has done a lot in terms of SAARC. It was one of the first countries to take leadership there. So you do see that attempt that, look, countries can't really rely on major powers at the moment. And there was a sense clearly that most of the major powers have not behaved in a manner that behoves a major power. Because traditionally we have relied on big powers to rally the world around a crisis, during a crisis, and lead from the front. But this time it was completely chaos at the very beginning. And that anarchy, almost anarchical situation that you witness in the early phases of this crisis has generated this concern that perhaps new kinds of leadership are needed, and countries, smaller countries, regional countries, middle players have taken it upon themselves to provide that leadership. So I think this might be the moment of middle power diplomacy, and energizing of that diplomacy might be the way out for the kind of crises, multiple crises that we are witnessing.
So we will be probably also looking at a very reformed multilateralism, because there is an increase in humanitarian diplomacy. We've seen France and Germany, they've launched an alliance for multilateralism, which has about 25 countries, and it aims at boosting the rule-based order. You mentioned Australia and New Zealand. They've also been funding the WHO in their regional pandemic plan, even though US suspended the funding of WHO. So all of this is happening, and a new kind of multilateralism may probably emerge.
Yes, I think we are going to see a lot of push after this crisis, or I think we might see a lot of push after this crisis, where these middle powers, middle players, push for a reformed set of engagements as far as global order is concerned, because clearly the multilateral order that we have been so used to has shown its limits during this crisis. We have seen how from the top of United Nations Security Council to technical institutions like WHO have all been looking very, very compromised at this point and unable to deal effectively with a crisis of this magnitude. So I think we are going to see a lot of push from countries that have been traditionally outside this fray, but have shown during this crisis that they are, their role becomes inevitable. Their role becomes almost central to the way global order is going to evolve and to the way we are going to react to future crises going forward. So I think reform multilateralism is something that India has also been demanding for a long time, that the multilateral order needs to be reformed, new voices needs to be brought in, they need to be cultivated, and they need to be given a place at that forum, at all these fora where certain only established set of countries, a traditional set of countries have spoken out. Now, after this crisis, I think there will be a lot of support from various quarters that we not only need a new set of rules, a new set of institutions, but also we need a greater partnership from countries, greater role for those countries who have shown exemplary performance given their resource constraints at a time of great crisis, while those countries that we traditionally thought, or traditionally relied upon for managing the global crisis have actually done very little, or have had a very negative impact during this crisis.
Yes, we saw at the NAM meet that Prime Minister Modi called for a new order of globalization. He said we do need a new global framework, which is more representative of the current concerns. It could be climate change, it could be health. We've seen that there was the creation of the SAARC COVID-19 fund and how India led there, then the NAM summit where the Prime Minister participated for the first time after assuming office. Does this mean, what does it signify really in terms of the relevance of SAARC and NAM? Because NAM was kind of irrelevant in the contemporary situation, but right now with all of them coming together, what does this mean?
Well, I don't think it sort of signifies that some people have argued that, is NAM back or non-alignment, India reverts back to non-alignment. I don't think in that sense, non-alignment can be brought back from where it was, because clearly the world has changed, its requirements have changed, and countries who are even part of non-alignment today do not look very non-aligned at all. I mean, they have relationships perhaps both with China and with America. I mean, what is the sort of context of non-alignment today that we are talking about? So I don't think in the traditional sense non-alignment would go forward or might go forward. But I certainly think that it's a platform where where countries with similar set of concerns about the global order are present. So Prime Minister, I think, very effectively used that platform, which in fact his government had not been very keen on for quite a while. But he used that platform at the time of this crisis partly to rally those countries and to give a sense about this aspect that we were talking about earlier. That look, we can't rely on traditional leaderships in the world. And clearly the traditional, the traditional agenda of globalization, the traditional agenda of security, the traditional institutional frameworks that we have, all of them will need to be revamped. And therefore, for countries like India and other countries who sit on NAM, perhaps need to have a much more active role when it comes to reordering of this, of the global platforms. And therefore, in some ways, India was conveying to via NAM and also via SAARC, its ability to mobilize within its own constraints certain kinds of on certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of countries, so that Indian leadership also it gets projected, but at the same time it gets projected in a manner that is about public good, that is about global good, that is about helping countries who need Indian help in that sense. So clearly what we have seen is that the shift towards SAARC, or to this use of NAM platform by Prime Minister, seems to me to be an effective way to convey to the world that while the other institutions have been found completely wanting, here are some other platforms available where India can have an effective voice given its own limitations, and where India can project a sense of order in a world that is increasingly moving towards grave disorder.
Absolutely. Like you said, Prime Minister Modi very effectively used the platform, SAARC platform and NAM to reach out to its neighbors and probably also fill in the leadership vacuum. What are the kind of opportunities that you see for India at this moment in this kind of shifting world order, like what we are looking at right now? The power centers are shifting. What are the opportunities as well as the challenges that face India at this moment?
See, challenges, Nagma, are huge, because challenges, of course, like every other country that is, that is grappling with a set of challenges. We have a health challenge, then we move on to the economic challenge, and then we have a social challenge. How do you make sure that your social peace and equity is preserved in an environment where resources are going to be, you will be very resource constrained, and you will have to manage with less. India has been fortunate for the last several decades. India has been growing a major economy, so the growth rate will be dramatically down. So how do you manage your social peace, social equity, social harmony, as well as your developmental needs at a time of this crisis? So clearly there is a lot that needs to be done internally. But I think what perhaps Prime Minister in India has been trying to showcase is very interesting, is that yes, we all need to look inwards, but there is no getting away from the fact that you need a global coordinated response. If all of the countries, especially those which are at the bottom of the ladder, can be helped out, if they are to come out of this crisis unscathed. And I think that is what the challenge is for India. And India has been projecting that sense that with all our constraints, we are willing to help first our neighbors, then certain other countries. If you look at the number of countries India has been able to help, very limited, even in its own limited ways. I think that tells the story about India's rise. In India's ability, I think more than India's rise, it's India's ability to or willingness to take up that leadership challenge. And I think that is a kind of a difference we have seen during this crisis, and especially also if you compare it with other countries, especially if you compare it with established countries, which have sometimes, more often than not, have been found wanting during this crisis.
Established countries have been more often than not found wanting, but we've seen a very interesting phenomena of the emergence or the rise of the middle countries. And probably we are looking at a multipolar order after this. Thank you so much for this discussion, Harsh, and thank you, all of you, for joining us on this episode of Ideas Factory.